Could Southern Cal be interested in Desiree Reed-Francois? Plus, a big Gold Rush recruiting weekend is yet to actually get any results for Missouri, but I wouldn't worry just yet. I'm feeling pretty optimistic about football recruiting. All of a sudden, I want to explain to you why coming up right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters. I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And I want to start really quickly here. Gabe DeArmond over at Power Mizzou, who I certainly quote frequently. He says Desiree Reed-Francois is not going to Southern Cal, at least according to his source. So this is good news. Hopefully that's true, because I got to tell you, we really need Desiree Reed-Francois around here. Obviously, it's been mentioned a million times how Missouri is never going to be at the top of the heap in terms of spending in the Southeastern Conference, at least not in the near future. That's for sure. Who knows what happens decades from now, but as things stand currently, we're just never going to compete in terms of spending with Alabama. It's just not going to happen. So what we need is some smart people in charge who can get the absolute most out of our resources. And I think that's what Desiree Reed-Francois has done a great job of so far in her relatively short tenure here in Columbia. So to me, this was really great news to hear that she's probably going to be hanging around. Although obviously USC historically has one of the greatest college football programs of all time. Also some sticky wickets when dealing with the alums. There's just some very strange dynamics over in that athletic department. So despite at first glance the glitter and the glam of Los Angeles, and she's from the Bay Area, relatively close to LA, obviously much closer than Missouri anyway, so you can understand why there might be some interest there. Bottom line is, this is really good news for Missouri if indeed she's sticking around, and well, by all indications and anonymous sources out there, it sure sounds like she is, and thank goodness for that, because if you're going to be reeling in guys like Ryan Wingo, the stud 5-star wide receiver from the St. Louis area, Williams Nwaneri, the Lee Summit product 5-star defensive lineman. Well, those two guys were in town this past weekend. Nwaneri ultimately ended up in Georgia for about half the weekend as well. And if you're going to compete with Georgia, well, you're going to have to have a really excellent pitch. And well, I happen to know somebody who actually heard Eli Drinkwitz pitch, at least the pitch he gave to a room full of people, including Williams Nwaneri and Ryan Wingo. And basically the pitch that he sold to these guys is, hey, you can either be another cog in the wheel, in the machine that is the Georgia Bulldogs, for instance, or you can be a legend at the University of Missouri. Plus, one, if not both of these young men were taken to Jefferson City this past weekend as well. I think the implications are pretty obvious there. That's a nod to Missouri's favorable name, image, and likeness laws for athletes, especially in regards to high school athletes. So here's your pitch. If you're Eli Drinkwitz there too, you're taking them to a nice meal in Jeff City, maybe meeting a couple congressmen, whatever it is, you're saying, hey, how about instead of waiting until 2024, that football season, to cash in on your name, image, and likeness, why not start now? Why not commit to Missouri right now and be out there in public and start saying, hey, I can't wait to be a Tiger next fall. And guess who's going to start sending you some offers? Well, Luther Burden already has quite a few offers. We've seen that. His latest was with Emo's Pizza in St. Louis. The guy's doing pretty well for himself for a college athlete. I promise you that. I think Ryan Wingo's obviously noticing this. Williams Nwaneri's obviously noticing this too. Will that be enough? Or again, do you want to just go for the two-time national champions? Who could really blame a kid for being attracted to that pitch as well? But the reason I'm starting to be a little more optimistic, about the state of Missouri football recruiting is that, well, we've got a pretty good pitch now all of a sudden. That name, image, and likeness thing, these laws in Jeff City and Missouri that have been handed down, that's real stuff. So I find that all very interesting. But it wasn't just about Ryan Wingo and Williams Nwaneri. There were several others on campus as well, including four-star linebacker Brian Huff from Jonesboro, Arkansas. In fact, the Razorbacks are likely the stiffest competition there, and he's going to announce in a couple weeks. So I suspect Wingo and Nwaneri, by the way, the two five-star kids, like Brian Huff, the kid I just mentioned, a four-star guy, if you're that highly rated, if you're at least a four-star, Gabe actually pointed this out in his thoughts this morning, his 10 morning thoughts. You know, these days on the calendar, those your plan A guys, essentially, which obviously all three of those guys I've mentioned so far are for Missouri. Those type of players are probably going to commit before the high school football season starts. They're not going to let it drag out into the fall. So that's something interesting to keep in mind. So in other words, just because so far there haven't been any announcements out of this Missouri weekend, that's really no reason to panic because, again, Gabe, a good breakdown here in his column, just the whole timeline is ironically changed a little bit. And I say ironically because we think of everything going more quickly in 2023. Well, in fact, who knows? There's almost certainly some guys, who knows if it's Wingo or Nwaneri or Huff or whoever it might be. But in the next week or so, we're probably going to see some relatively well-produced Twitter videos or Instagram videos, for instance, announcing their commitment to Missouri. Whereas back in the day, somebody like Gabe DeArmond would just call him up on the phone and get the information. Well, obviously there's a lot more pomp and circumstance to these online announcements these days. So that does actually very well explain where we are in terms of the recruiting timeline. And coming up, obviously, the real results on the football field at this point are even more important for Eli Drinkwitz than what may happen in a few years with some of his high school recruiting in theory, right? He's not going to even get there if he goes 5-7 this year, quite possibly. So what does he have to do to make sure to maximize his chances at having a winning season at Missouri for the first time? Well, first of all, I think he's got to be more aggressive on fourth down. I have some good numbers to back up this assertion coming up. But first, I want to tell you about, yes, one of our finest sponsors. It's FanDuel. Yes, FanDuel Sportsbook. Baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets. If your first bet doesn't win, just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. And you know what? No matter what you're into, it could be baseball, it could be basketball. My God, they have absolutely everything you could possibly imagine to bet on FanDuel. I really mean that. So again, don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball trademarks used with permission. Thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. And for you everydayers, coming up on the next show, I want to talk a little bit about the NCAA video game, just in terms of the college players, well, holding out, it sounds like, a lot of them, for maybe bigger gains. I just want to give them some advice as to not overplay their hand. But of course, we'll talk about that on the next edition of Locked On Mizzou. Right now, I want to talk about Eli Drinkwitz and his aggression, or maybe lack thereof. You know, I've thought a lot in the recent past, especially last season. I just thought Eli Drinkwitz not quite aggressive enough on going for it on fourth downs. In particular, especially when I came in analyzing Appalachian State's 2019 season, I really thought Drinkwitz had some excellent plans and play calls during special situations like 4th down and 3, especially when App State upset North Carolina, for example, early in that season. Well, if you look at Missouri's numbers last season, their go for it rates and their profit per game, how many points they were getting by going for it on fourth down per game, how much they're actually profiting from those decisions? Well, this comes from Mizzou guy Bill Conley, by the way, online at ESPN Plus. But all these numbers really back up what I saw because, in fact, last year, Missouri was actually pretty good on fourth down, very much above average, just outside of the top 25 nationally. In fact, 26th in the country in terms of profit per game on fourth down. But the problem is, well, they just didn't go for it very much. Whether you look at it in terms of their actual go for it rate overall, or if you normalize the data in terms of, okay, yeah, we're not going to count you're going for it when you're down 48-0 in the fourth quarter. That doesn't really count. We're going to normalize the data here. But without going in too deeply here, either way, you're looking at Missouri's 103rd or 95th. Either way, that's well below average when you consider there's about 130 FBS football teams last time I checked. So those two numbers just don't really go together, 26th and about 100th. Well, if you're that good at it and going for it on fourth down, to me, you got to go for it more often, don't you? That's a pretty obvious conclusion there. But even more so than that, I think if Brady Cook is your starting quarterback, which at this point I'm certainly not assuming by any stretch of the imagination, if I had to take a guess, as of today, I'll say it's Brady Cook. Apparently, Gabe DeArmond thinks it's Sam Horn. So that just tells you it's up in the air, right? But my point is, if it is Cook, or really, Horn's a pretty good runner too. So I've heard, or so I've been told, right? But Cook is definitely a good runner, one of the best parts of his game. And my point in bringing that up is if he's your starter, use his legs, especially in short yardage situations, fourth down and 2. You've got to use Brady Cook properly. And I think actually, again, if you have that running quarterback, gives you one more body in essence in the running game since you don't have to hand the ball off. Well, that's an even more of a reason to go for it on those fourth and short situations, in my opinion. Plus, Luther Burden, just throwing him the ball out in space, he's pretty good at getting 3 or 4 yards, too. We saw that last season, scored multiple touchdowns in the red zone in those spots. So, to me, just a lot more going for it in fourth and short situations, maybe, red zone situations inside the 5, where even if you don't get it, you pin the team back. I just want to see Drinkwitz be a lot more aggressive in what is sort of a make-or-break season for him in 2023. By the way, primo seats for Missouri and Memphis. I believe week 2. Yeah, I think week 2, maybe week 4. I'm not even sure off the top of my head. Don't have the football schedule memorized as of yet. But regardless, in September, Missouri and Memphis are playing football in the Dome in St. Louis. $65 for real premium seats, which I was pleasantly surprised by. And I don't know, again, I mentioned Desiree Reed-Francois beginning of the show. I don't know how much, if any, control she has in terms of negotiating or setting ticket prices for that game, but whoever's in charge there and put those at, to me, relatively reasonable prices for what's a good game, but it's not Missouri and Illinois. And guess what? The last few Missouri and Illinois games didn't exactly fill the house 100%. They were good crowds, but especially on the Illinois side, I think maybe they started getting a little bit tired of the butt whoopings the Tigers were putting on them in football during that time. Perhaps a reason why the series didn't continue as well. But again, I was expecting north of $100 probably to sit, 20 rows up the 50-yard line, but no, $65. That's pretty reasonable. Hey, Missouri fans, I think I'm going to plan to get my butt up to the Dome this fall, and I think you should too. Let's show out and give a really big crowd for St. Louis too, by the way. Ryan Wingo, 5-star receiver, possibly could get him. Hey, we already got Luther Burden, going to be plenty other 5-star players down the pike out of St. Louis and just good football players, period. So let's show up and get loud for that Memphis game. And by the way, an important game for the Tigers too. Don't by any means think that's a gimme. And coming up, Dennis Gates recently talked about how he wants Missouri fans to be kind to Connor Vanover off the court in particular. And, well, I can relate to this message a little bit, so let's talk about that right after this. Well, Missouri, certainly this offseason, after signing 7'5" center Connor Vanover, recently played at Oral Roberts previously, played for the Arkansas Razorbacks for a couple years before that. Well, again, Missouri definitely got a lot more intimidating walking off the bus, no doubt about that. But I think a lot of times people can look at tall people and sort of dehumanize them a little bit. And Dennis Gates said something very similar to that. And he says he thinks it's important to not treat Connor like he's, quote, a circus act. In other words, don't just be constantly asking him how tall he is. Don't ask for pictures of him standing next to 5'10" Nick Honor, for instance. So I did think that was kind of interesting and kind of a good message for some people to hear because, you know, God knows I'm not 7'5". In fact, I'm about a foot shorter than Connor Vanover. But I can just remember when I was 15 years old and suddenly sprouted up to like 6'3" or something. And I'm taller than all my teachers and the principal and my basketball coach and all that stuff. And that was just suddenly very strange for me. I was not used to all that stuff, looking my dad in the eye and all that kind of things. So I can kind of understand what it's like to be the tall guy a little bit, just not to that extreme. If you're 7'5", I mean, honestly, life is a little bit uncomfortable for you at times. Imagining having to stuff yourself into a bus or, God forbid, a commercial airliner or just a regular vehicle of any kind, an Uber, good luck. I mean, you're gonna be paying for that XL the rest of your life. I promise you that. So I do think that's an important message. And, you know, there's a lot of people who just feel like it's okay to just pick on the big guy. You know, it's just true. I think it's kind of human nature a little bit. It is sort of like the other, that type of thing. So again, good message from Dennis Gates. I'm honestly glad he put it out there. I did think, though, it was sort of ironic and amusing that when trying to make this point, as he was talking to Dave Matter of STL Today, is that what they call it now? Is it no longer the Post-Dispatch? Is it just stltoday.com? I don't even know anymore, but I digress. The point is, I just thought it was funny. Dennis Gates was going, "Hey, Dave, you're like 5'5", right?" And Matter was like, excuse me, I'm 5'7", sir, which I thought was hilarious. That's sort of like, listen, not trying to make fun of you short guys. I got a lot of short guys who are really good friends of mine. No big deal. I just know from their perspective that 2 inches is a big deal. Okay. That's sort of like saying to a woman, like, "Hey, what are you, like 55 or something?" And she's like, "I'm 38. Thank you very much." Ooh, yeah. Not a good look there, but no, it's okay, Dennis Gates. I'm just busting your chops. Just thought that was an amusing moment. And actually, again, I totally agree with his message about, yeah, let's treat Connor Vanover like he's a human being and not like he's just some circus animal that we're all gawking at. That would be nice. But anyway, maybe that's just me talking as a tall guy. But you know what? Speaking of, I do a lot of talking as a tall guy on this program, don't I? And I thank you for listening to it every day. And for all you everydayers out there, again, I'll be back talking to you next time about how I think NCAA football players collectively should be careful and not overplaying their hand when it comes to negotiations on this upcoming video game. So until next time, I am John Miller, and thanks as always for listening to Locked on Mizzou.